Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we're going to go over part 3 of Chapter 17 from The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. Chapter 17 is called Further Elaboration Through Culture and Imagination. So I've broken Chapter 17 down into 5 parts. We've already gone through the introduction, which we talked about exploring the laws of nature. And then we talked about imagination in the second video, which I absolutely love the topic of imagination and Montessori. So make sure to go back and take a look at that so you can have a better understanding about how Montessori viewed imagination. And today we're going to go over language and practical life. And keep in mind that I'm not going completely in order for this chapter. Instead, I decided to break this chapter down into the 5 different parts or the 5 different themes that I thought were going on in this chapter, and then we were going to go through each of those themes separately instead of all together. I feel like this chapter is really big and she goes a lot of places with this chapter, and that's why I'm breaking it down into the different segments that I've done. Before we get started on language and practical life, I just want to make sure that everybody out there knows that there are 4 main areas of the primary Montessori environment: language, practical life, sensorial, and math. Now, if you are AMS trained, you might say that there is also an area for geography. And in the AMI training, what we do is we put geography into other areas. Geography for AMI goes into sensorial because we're not teaching geography directly, but we're giving the sensorial impression of geography. Or if we're learning something about a continent, it might end up in the language area. So instead of having a separate area for geography, it really kind of gets divided up into different areas. With that being said, let's start exploring how Montessori approached language in Chapter 17 of The Absorbent Mind. On page 154, we're going to start talking about language and sensitivity. And Montessori says children feel a special interest for those things already rendered familiar to them by absorption in the earlier period. On these, they can focus their minds with great ease. For example, the children's explosion into writing is closely connected with his special sensitivity for language, and this was operative at the time when he began to speak. By the age of 5.5 or 6, this sensitivity has ceased to exist. So it is clear that writing can be learned with joy and enthusiasm only before that age. She continues on to say children older than this have lost the special opportunity which nature grants them of learning to write without making special and conscious efforts of application and will. Now, I don't know if you agree with that, but if you study Montessori and if you study that primary environment where children just absorb language so easily, you might be able to see what she's saying here. You might be able to see that after the age of 6, we have to teach children about language. But before the age of 6, when we present it to them, especially if we present it to them in a very multisensory and sensorial way, they absorb it and they retain it better. So that's what she's saying right here. And continuing on page 154, Montessori starts talking about language and indirect preparation. She says, all the same, we know from other experiences that this easy writing does not come from our use of the sensitive period alone. It also depends on certain preparatory exercises which the child does at an earlier stage still, when his hand is busy with our carefully designed apparatus for practicing his powers of sensorial discrimination. For this reason, a new principle has found its way into our method, the principle of indirect preparation. And if you're wondering here what she's talking about with indirect preparation, think about the development of the hand. When we go to write with a pencil in the primary environment, that's not our first preparation for writing. Our first preparation for writing and working with a pencil is not using a pencil at all. It's developing the muscles in the hand through practical life work. So that's what she's talking about as far as indirect preparation. The fact that we can do a work in other areas of the room, something that seems unrelated, and yet when we go to start writing, we've already prepared in other ways for this experience. Montessori says nature herself works on this principle. Even in the embryo, she builds organs in anticipation of the need, which the individual will have for them. And only when the machinery exists does she call it into action. Now, if you're confused about what this means, we covered this in earlier chapters. So when we were talking about the embryo and the formation of the child inside the womb, we really talked about how all these organs are being built. Even after birth, the organs are still growing and developing. But being born is not the end of the experience for that development. That these organs don't actually fulfill their purpose until they're being used. So while there's this development going on before and after birth with all the different organs, they're not complete until we use them. On page 155, Montessori starts talking about language and grammar. She says, in acquiring speech, we have seen that the child in the first period passes through a series of phases as precisely ordered as those in the grammar book. In turn, he enunciates separate sounds, syllables, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and the rest. We therefore know that we can help him in the second period by following the same sequence. Yes, we shall teach him grammar from the first. And truly, it sounds absurd in today's way of thinking that we should start our first direct teaching of language with grammar, and that the child can begin learning this before he begins to read and write. So let's talk about what she just said right there, because that's a pretty bold statement to be able to teach grammar from the very beginning. And again, I want to note that my perspective is coming from the AMI training. In my AMI training, I go through all those basic grammar lessons and even sentence analysis before the child even gets into first grade. So how does this happen? Let me give you a little bit of an overview here of what it looks like to go through my AMI language album. Language lessons begin very early on with simple games like I Spy, and then we move on to the sandpaper letters and do the phonetic letter sounds. So we're just doing those individual letter sounds. And when we introduce vowels, we introduce the short vowel sounds. And this starts around the age of 3 years old. So right here, again, if we go back and take a look at what she said here, enunciating separate sounds is the first step, right? That's what we do first. So that's also what we do inside the classroom. And then writing begins after the child knows about 10 to 15 separate sounds. And when we do the writing, we use what's called the movable alphabet. And when we use the movable alphabet, when we start writing, we use simple closed syllable words. Very simple CVC consonant, vowel, consonant words. And the child just sounds them out with the movable alphabet. And the reason why we use a movable alphabet instead of just writing on paper is for two basic reasons. The first reason is that if you make a mistake with the movable alphabet, you don't have to erase, you just change it out. So it makes it a little bit easier for a child to correct any errors or change their mind about different sounds that they want to use. The second reason why we use a movable alphabet is because the child's hand at this age is still struggling to develop. We're still working on that development. So the movable alphabet gives the child an opportunity to write without placing too much of a burden on the muscles in his hand. So that's why we use the movable alphabet. So that starts around 4 years old. Around that same time, after the child is writing, because in the Montessori environment, we write before we read, so that comes first. So after the child begins writing, the child begins to read. And these reading lessons begin after the writing, and we use a lesson called the first object box or the phonetic object box. And these are simple, closed syllable words that we match with objects. After that, we start introducing other syllables. And if you are familiar with the green sandpaper letters, these are our phonograms. These are our syllables. Now, the green sandpaper letters do not include all the syllables. There are 7 types of syllables. So if you're in your Montessori environment and you are just depending on what's in your green sandpaper letters, that's not quite enough to get you through all 7 syllables. In AMI, we begin grammar lessons around 4 to 5 years old, starting with the article and the noun. And these are very simple lessons. And then we move on to the adjective, conjunction, preposition, verb, adverb, etc. But we don't do this directly. We always use objects with this. We always use a sensorial experience of the grammar. So that's why we call this a sensorial impression of grammar and not just direct grammar lessons. For example, if I was going to teach the adjective, we teach the adjective with the farm. We'll set up a farm with all the animals, and the animals will have different variations. And I might write down on a piece of paper, the horse. And the child will bring me a horse, and I'll say, oh, you know what? This is a horse, but this is not the horse I'm looking for. I'm going to have to give you another clue. And so I will write the brown horse. And the child will have to go and find the brown horse. Now, if there's more than one type of brown horse, I might say the large brown horse. And so we get into this experience of grammar when we're teaching this. And then we go on to a more difficult variation of the adjective lessons with the detective adjective game, where the child has to figure out what triangle I'm thinking of. And so it becomes this game of putting out clues for the child to figure out, what triangle am I thinking of? Is it obtuse? Is it an equilateral? Is it red? Is it yellow? Is it blue? Is it a scalene? So we have to put all these clues out for the child. And this happens usually around kindergarten. So we're doing all of these lessons before the child even gets into first grade. The thing is, when you introduce these lessons before the age of 6, and you go through all those indirect preparations for these lessons, and remember, we're not just jumping into this. We've had a lot of indirect preparations to go into this. So when we introduce this, the child is absorbing it. They're not learning it, they're just absorbing it. And it's so much easier than having to go and teach it later on in life. And once we move through this part of grammar in the primary environment, we actually can offer lessons on simple sentence analysis. And I've done this before my students move into first grade as well. Now, sometimes we don't always get to these lessons. There may be years where you have children who are not ready for this. And when we went through COVID, a lot of the children fell behind, right? And so a lot of the lessons that we have in our albums, we weren't able to get to because of external factors. Or you might just have children who are not ready for this. Maybe they didn't have the indirect preparation, or maybe they have a learning disability. So in Montessori, we have the flexibility to go so far beyond the regular standards of education that you would think about for a kindergarten environment, but at the same time, we can also adapt, and we can bring it back to the child's needs and adapt those lessons down to the very basics. And if a kindergartner really just needs to focus on phonics and simple CVC words, reading simple CVC words and writing simple CVC words, and not get into that grammar before first grade, we can do that too. So on page 156, Montessori talks about language and enthusiasm. She says, I began choosing words from the higher learning. For example, the names of the geometric figures, which the children handle when using our sensorial apparatus. Polygons, trapezia, triangles of various kinds, etc. The children learned them all. So we wrote the names of scientific instruments, thermometer, barometer, etc., then passed on to botanical items. Insatiable at this age is the child's thirst for words, and inexhaustible his capacity for learning them. But this is not true of the next period. Other faculties are then being born, and the child learns new words with much greater difficulty. So when we're talking about language, and we're talking about these scientific words, and we're talking about the different types of triangles, like I was talking about earlier, children really do have the capacity to learn that at 4 and 5 years old, even 3 years old. Montessori says, we saw that the children who had learned these words early in life retained them and could use them fluently after going on to the ordinary schools when they were 8 or 9 and in the years which followed. But the results were much inferior when children of 8 and older were taught these same words for the first time. We have to conclude that scientific words are best taught to children between the ages of 3 and 6. Not in a mechanical way, of course, but in conjunction with the objects concerned, or in the course of their explorations, so that their vocabulary keeps pace with their experiences. So what we're saying here is that indirect preparation is really important for every area. That we want to give children words and language for everything that they experience. And we need to do this very carefully, but we also want to give this to them in a sensorial way. So we need to make sure that we are giving them the opportunity to explore geometric shapes, geometric solids, parts of a leaf, parts of a flower, geography. Children can learn every single state in the United States before they get into first grade. They can learn all the countries in Africa before first grade. There is no limit to what children in this first plane of development can learn. But first they have to have that experience. And that's what Montessori is talking about right here, that we need to allow children to have that exploration. And then we build the language on top of it. And if a child is naturally exploring things in their environment, it's going to be really easy to bring the language in too. And then they are capable of not just learning this language, absorbing this language, but retaining it and using it later on. And if we wait until later to give them these experiences and to give them this language, it's much more difficult for them. Let's switch gears a little bit, and now let's talk about practical life. On pages 160 to 161, Montessori talks about practical life and precision. She says, in thousands of cases, we have seen that the child not only needs something interesting to do, but also likes to be shown exactly how to do it. Precision is found to attract him deeply, and this it is that keeps him at work. From this, we must infer that his attraction towards these manipulative tasks has an unconscious aim. The child has an instinct to coordinate his movements and to bring them under control. And after precision, Montessori starts talking about repetition. She says, another observation of supreme importance is that the child, when captivated by a piece of work, repeats the same series of movements time after time. Nothing is more astonishing than to see one of our children engaged in a so-called exercise of practical life, completely absorbed, for example, in polishing a brass vessel and carefully following his instructions till it shines brilliantly. Then without pause, beginning all over again and repeating every detail till he has polished the already shining pot several times over. Montessori says this proves that the external aim was only a stimulus. The real aim was to satisfy an unconscious need. And this is why the operation is formative, for the child's repetition was laying down in his nervous system an entirely new system of controls. In other words, establishing fresh coordinations between his muscles. Coordinations not given by nature, but having to be acquired. It happens no differently with ourselves in sport, in all the games that we repeat with enthusiasm. On page 161, Montessori starts talking about practical life and play. She says, it is true that in all these activities, the child may be said to be playing, but this kind of play is effortful and leads him to acquire the new powers, which will be needed for his future. His instinct has been awakened to adapt himself to the needs of his day, and it takes the form of laborious effort of inner construction. But this kind of effort is proper to childhood, and that is why I say that imitativeness in children is a kind of inspiration, which leads them to self-constructive work. So let's think about what she's saying here. She says that this type of play is effortful and leads him to acquire new powers, which he will need for his future. So when we're talking about the type of play that children are doing in a Montessori environment, the first thing that we need to keep in mind is purpose. What is the purpose of this work? What is the purpose of this play? If it isn't purposeful, then we tend to not include it in the Montessori classroom. On page 162, Montessori talks about practical life and behavior. She says, so it is with these exercises of practical life that the warp of general behavior is laid down for a particular nation or race. In the period from 3 to 6, the cloth itself is woven and perfected. Hence, the period under 6 is decisive. Whatever abilities the child constructs then will remain incarnate in him for life. His ways of moving and of doing things become fixed and permanent features of his personality. So that's all I have on chapter 17 today. Let's go through a little bit of a summary of all of this. When you think about how we're teaching grammar, we're going to go through it the same way as we understand the development of learning to talk. If you think about how children progress in their talking, you can also mirror that with the grammar lessons. They should parallel. We also have to keep in mind that children have the desire and ability to learn and retain complex scientific words before the age of 6. In this period of life, they absorb language. After the age of 6, they must put effort into learning language. So make sure you do have a language-rich environment. But that language only comes after the experience. So make sure that you have a lot of experiences in your classroom that you can give language for. Children before the age of 6 are fascinated by precise movement. And they're going to practice that. They're going to repeat it. They're going to repeat this precision until a new skill has been formed. And it's really important that this new skill is important for their future, that it has purpose. It's an indirect preparation for life. The work of the child is to adapt himself to the needs of his day. Play is his work, and this prepares him for what is to come later in life. His work or his play should be purposeful. Montessori says imitation of the adult stems from the child being inspired by the adult's work. This is an inspiration to the child, and it leads to self-construction. So when you see your child imitating you, or if you see your students imitating you, this is inspiring them. They're not just copying you, they're being inspired by you. And you can use that inspiration to help the child construct himself. And the most important thing to take away from this video is that between the ages of 0 and 6, the foundation of general behavior is set. Montessori says whatever experiences we are having during those ages, that is going to lay down a general behavior for the rest of our lives. It's going to set that foundation. The child's way of moving, speaking, and experiencing the world becomes fixed and permanent during this age. So that's all I have for you today on part 3 of chapter 17 of the Absorbent Mind. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed learning about language and practical life. The next video for this series on chapter 17 is going to be about sensorial in math. And also keep in mind that even though I am breaking chapter 17 down into 5 separate videos, this is still just a drop in the bucket. So make sure to pick up your copy of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori and read along with me so that you have a deeper and better understanding of what she's talking about in each of these videos. If you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.